Hi, welcome to Bits and Pieces Quilting. Today I want to take you through a tour of some of my very favorite scrap quilts. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Michelle, and today I want to do a trunk show of some of my very favorite type of quilts, scrappy quilts. I have 10 of them to show you today, and I'm looking forward to diving right in. The first quilt I want to share is this really colorful Irish chain. It is made up of some of the brightest brights from my collection of fabrics. Set off against white, I think it really makes the colors pop, and I think it's just a fun and cheerful quilt. I've used a scrappy binding on this one as well without borders. I thought the size was big enough that it didn't require a border, and I didn't want one particular color to dominate the entire quilt. There's a bit of an I Spy element to the quilt as well, with a little Tweety Bird and other fun little pieces of fabric that pop up throughout. It was a fun quilt to make, and I really love the colors. The second quilt on our tour of scrappy quilts is a batik quilt. This one comes from Kim Brackett's Scrap Basket Sensations quilt. I love Kim's quilts. I have 3 of her books and they're all excellent. This one is the Flower Boxes quilt. And as you can see from the pattern and from my photos of the finished quilt, it has this appearance of blocks stacked one on top of the other, and I love that illusion that this quilt has. I did it all in batiks. It's a pattern that works really well with 2.5-inch strips, so I was able to use up a lot of the scraps I had in my batik drawer that were 2.5 inches wide. Some of them were as small as just 2.5 inches square, and then other pieces required a slightly longer 2.5-inch piece of fabric. I think the colors are bright and cheerful. It's a big quilt in the end. It is, let me check, it's about 65 inches square, so it's a really nice size to cuddle up in front of the TV to watch a movie or to read a good book. The third quilt on our tour of scrappy quilts is this Postage Stamp quilt. This was a huge technical challenge for me because all of the pieces started at 1.5 inches and finished at 1 inch, which is why I call it a postage stamp quilt. Those are really, really tiny pieces in there. And this was a unique opportunity for me as well to challenge my color theory. And I threw everything into this quilt. You can see the colors that dominate my fabric collection. They're all those muted kind of traditional prints and colors, but there are some brights popping up here and there throughout the quilt. As I made the blocks, I messed around with a couple of different layouts. The first was sort of an around the world shape, and then I decided on a more linear final layout for the quilt. The final product was really heavy, especially for its size. With all those little pieces all sewn together, the weight was a lot more than I was expecting. The next quilt was an opportunity to use up some of my solids. I don't use solids very often in my quilting, and I had a collection of them that I found difficult to work into other scrappy quilts. So I decided to let them all stand on their own and make this pineapple quilt out of the leftover solids. I used the pineapple trim tool from Creative Grids, and this was a really, really fun tool to use. I don't very often buy a lot of specialty rulers, but I saw this demonstrated by Jenny Doan on Missouri Star Quilt and was really intrigued by how easy it was to make what looks like a very complicated block. And it was a perfect choice for these solids. The next quilt in our Scrappy Trunk show is a quilt called Island Chain, and it's another quilt from the Kim Brackett book. In hers, she uses a lot of mixed batiks, and I took this same inspiration for the quilt that I made. It's another quilt that I think has some beautiful elegance to it because of the batiks. And I really love the illusion of the interlocking squares. It's a little challenging to put together because you have to lay out the entire quilt before you start sewing it together. But I had enough floor space to lay the whole thing out, and I was thrilled with the illusion that came out in the end. I've actually made this quilt 2 or 3 different times just because I think it is so spectacular. The next quilt is the apple core quilt. This was such a challenge. I hadn't done curved seams before, but I bought the template, the apple core template from Missouri Star Quilt, and thought I would challenge myself with a new technique by trying to sew curved seams. And you know, those first seams to sew 2 apple core blocks together, once you got the hang of it, it wasn't really difficult. And so I made all kinds of sets of 2. But then to sew the sets of 2 into sets of 4, oh my gosh, that was challenging because not only did you have an up curve, but then a down curve all in the same block. And then to sew the sets of 4 into rows, or maybe I sewed them into sets of 16, like 4 patches, and then oh my gosh, it was so challenging. It took me so many pins and so many clips and so many seams to open and redo again. It was a huge challenge to my skills, and I'm thrilled with the final result. But it's the sort of quilt that if you get up a little too close, you start to notice where there's some puffiness, where the seams didn't lay quite as flat as I would have liked. But machine quilting all over the surface tacked some of that down, and I don't think it's very noticeable in the final product. This was a real challenge for my skills, but it was also a lot of fun in the end. I think I've maybe recovered from the trauma. You'll see in a later video that I have worked on Drunkard's Path, which is also a curved template. And I think that turned out much better because there was only 1 curve in the entire block before then sewing straight blocks together. Let me know in the comments down below if you've ever tried the apple core quilt and if you have any secrets for making those curved seams work beyond the initial single piece. The next quilt I want to highlight is this single Irish chain, and it's a reverse Irish chain in that the chain is the background fabric and the individual blocks are made up of all kinds of different colors from my scrap bin. This is also a fun quilt, and I just love the impact of it. I've mixed the backgrounds, so there's a bunch of whites and beiges and creams as the chains, and then all of the different colors that make up the blocks. In some instances, you'll see as well that within each individual color block, there's more than 1 color as well. I tried to have them blend really well so it wasn't that noticeable, but really wanted to dip into my scrap basket for this one. Quilt number 8 is this Scrappy half square triangle quilt. I'll do a tutorial in the future on how to make this quilt and how to make all of the blocks, including a pattern on my website. I'll let you know when that's ready. But this was a fun project to really bust into all of those scraps that I really wasn't sure what to do with and that really didn't fit into other projects. The background is consistent across the entire quilt, which I think brings it an element of unity. And then the blocks themselves are wild and crazy with fabric from all kinds of different projects. In some ways, it serves as a little bit of a memory project for me as I look back on where the different fabrics came from that ended up in this final product. It's all half square triangles, so the layout is you can lay this out in thousands of different ways. I like the slightly modern, slightly offset setting that I decided to use in the end product here, and I think it turned out really well and really cozy. This is another quilt that's actually quite heavy given the number of pieces that make up the final product. Quilt number 9 is the half log cabin. This is one of my all-time favorite scrap quilt patterns. I have probably made 6 or 8, maybe even more of these quilts, and I love them. They never fail to satisfy my need to throw all my scraps together and make a beautiful quilt. The layout is a traditional log cabin layout with these half log cabin blocks. Sometimes I make the blocks bigger depending on how many scraps I have, just adding other rounds to the individual blocks. Sometimes I make the blocks smaller, again depending on the final size I'm looking at and the amount of scraps that I have. This is made with 2-inch strips of fabric. Someday I may try and do it in 1.5-inch strips and see what that turns out, or even going to a 2.5-inch strip to get a bigger scale on the half log cabin. In this particular example, I machine quilted some feathers in the light parts of the design, and then just a straight free motion in some in the printed fabric sections of the quilt. The final quilt to show is this circle illusion quilt. It's another quilt made out of batiks. These are 60-degree triangles and make use of a whole ton of different colors. I've also been able to figure out how to piece together some of those 60-degree triangles from the offcuts. When you cut just a right angle triangle from one end of the fabric, you can sew that to another right angle triangle. And especially because they are batiks, they don't have a right side or a wrong side to the fabric. So a scrappy quilt, sometimes even made out of leftover scraps. The illusion I think here is really strong because of the amount of background fabric. And when you put the different blocks together oriented slightly differently, you get this amazing circle, these interlocking circles that emerge. It's another favorite design. I've made a few others, and you'll see in an upcoming video when I talk about some mistakes that I've made, you'll see where the placement of the corner squares on these blocks can make a real difference to the final product. So there you have it, 10 scrappy quilts in a trunk show. I hope you found something here to inspire and delight. Leave a comment down below and let me know what your favorite is. And let me know if you have a favorite scrap quilt pattern that you go back to over and over again. Thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please subscribe, and don't forget to visit my website at bitsandpiecesquilting.com. Enjoy the process and make the most of your fabric bits and pieces.